The Maiden of the North. Feminist Folk Tales from Around the World by Ethel Johnston Phelps, author of Tattered and Other Tales. Illustrations by Lloyd Bloom. I had a bookmark in here on page 25. Fair Exchange, a Celtic Tale. There once was a young woman who was alone in the world except for her child. She had only a cow, a few chickens, and a small garden to get along. To earn a little money, she would go out to work in the fields at haying time and harvest time. One day she laid the baby on a rough piece of cloth in the shade of an old hawthorn tree, picked up a scythe, and took her place with the hay mowers. The lass had mowed several lengths of the field when she heard the baby wailing with hunger. She hurried to the hawthorn tree, thinking that the wailing did not sound at all like her sweet-tempered baby. When she got there, she saw that it was not a plump, dark-haired child that lay in the shade. It was a thin, scrawny baby with wisps of fair hair. She ran up and down the side of the field, searching for her own child, but there was not a sign of him. She called to the other mowers. No one had seen her baby, nor had they seen anyone come to the hawthorn tree. So she went back to the wailing baby, her heart breaking with grief. Then, because she was a kind-hearted lass, she took pity on the thin, pale child. She could not bear to see him so angry, so she nursed him. With a heavy heart she returned to the mowing, for she needed the money. But when the day was over, she felt she could not abandon the sickly child in the field all night. She carried the small bundle home with her. That evening and all the next day she went up and down the lanes of the village, asking everyone she met if they had seen her dark-haired, rosy-cheeked baby. No one had seen him. The fairy folk must have taken your child and left a sickly one in place of his own. And left a sickly child, one of their own, in his place, she was told. You must get rid of the changeling if you want your own back. But the advice they gave on how to get rid of the changeling was so cruel that she could not follow it. She made up her mind to get her own child back from the fairies, though how she was to do it she did not know. Nonetheless, as the weeks passed, she fed and cared for the strange, pale child as best she could. He no longer looked quite so frail and thin. His wisps of hair grew into thick red gold curls. He would soon be as plump and healthy as her own child. Your mother should see you now, thought the lass one day. You're so healthy and handsome she wouldn't know you. The summer had gone before the lass heard of an old woman who was said to know the ways of the fairy folk. Although the woman lived alone out on the moors some distance away, the lass trudged off at once to consult her. After she had told the woman of her stolen child, she said, Do you know where the fairy folk dwell? I'm determined to get my own child back. You're a brave lass, said the old woman, but do you know the danger in it? That doesn't matter, answered the lass. They can lame or blind those who annoy them, or do worse mischief, warned the old woman. They could keep you prisoner under the fairy hill forever. I wouldn't like that, but if I were with my own child again. But lass, if you go to their fairy hill, you'd be putting yourself in their power. When the lass did not answer, the woman sighed. Well, if you won't be warned, I'll tell you what I can. This is what I came for, said the lass. The fairy folk live under that big hill out yonder on the moors, said the woman. They don't come out very often, and when they do, there are few that can see them. Have you seen them? Asked the girl directly. Sometimes, the woman admitted. I did them a favor long ago, and they've been good neighbors to me. I want to see the queen, said the girl firmly. She will know who took my baby. The queen and all the folk came out of the hill on Halloween to ride abroad. That I do know, but it will do you no good. She'll fly into a rage if you demand your child back. I can try, said the girl. Don't expect the queen to take pity on your grief. Fairy folk have no hearts at all. 'Tis the way they are made. I'll not ask for pity, said the lass. all I'll ask is a fair exchange." "It's not a thing I'd dare do," said the old woman. The lass walked out to the fairy hill at once, for she thought she might find a way in. She walked in all around, poking at rocks, pulling at the bushes, but she could see no opening at all. At last she gave up and came away. She made up her mind, and she would come back on Halloween. The weeks passed slowly. Finally, the nuts ripened and fell. The leaves turned yellow, and red drifted from the trees. On Halloween, the lass milked the cow and fed the baby, and wrapping him against the chill wind, she started off for the fairy hill. The night was dark and heavy with clouds scudding across the moon. It was a long way out to the fairy hill on the moors, and the baby grew heavy in her arms. She paused to rest now and then, but not for long. When she reached the moors, it was so dark she couldn't see the hill. Twice she turned the wrong way. At last she reached the hill and sank wearily to the ground. She had no way of knowing if she was too early or too late, nor even which part of the hill would open to send the fairy folk forth. She waited in silence and the dark. She waited in the silence and the dark. After a little while her head nodded in weariness and she dozed. It was near midnight when she was jerked awake by the sound of silvery bells. Flowing out of the hill, some distance from where she sat, was a tiny troop of fairy folk. The queen rode before them on a white steed. In the glow of their own eerie fairy light, she could see that the queen was splendidly dressed in green and gold, her gleaming red gold hair flying behind her. The lass jumped to her feet, but the fairy folk came out of the hill with a rush of a strong wind, and were off in a flurry of jingling bells. The eerie fairy glow died away, and she was left standing on the empty moor in the moonlight. For a few moments she was overcome with despair. Then she said to herself with a sigh, "I never expected it would be easy." She stood for a moment, fixing in her mind by means of rocks and bushes just where the fairy hill had opened. "I'll stand right in their path next time," she thought. She went back to where the changeling lay asleep and carried him all the way long home. It was near dawn, and she opened the door to her small cottage, and there was a day's work ahead of her. The winter passed, cold, with sleet and icy rain. The fair-haired changeling grew sturdier, and he was silent, with a far-away look in his eyes. One spring day the lass met the old woman at the market. "I see you still have the changeling," said the old woman. "Yes," said the lass, "my eyes closed for weariness on Halloween, but I shall try again. Will the fairy folk come out on May Eve?" "They should," said the old woman. Then she added kindly, "Come early to my cottage and rest before you set out." "Thank you," said the lass. "I'll do that." On May Eve she arrived at the old woman's cottage early. The changeling was now a plump, handsome child, although his skin still had the whiteness of fairy kind. As soon as the sun set, the lass of the child went off to the fairy hill. She put the child to sleep beside her and settled down for a long wait. This time, when the hill opened with the jingling of silver bells on bridles, the lass was ready. The queen rode out splendidly radiant at the head of the fairy folk. The lass placed herself in their path. Now she ran forward and caught the bridle of the queen's steed. The queen raised her staff as if it were to strike. "Who dares to halt the queen?" she cried in cold anger. But before the queen could blind or cripple her, the lass cried out, "If you please, ma'am, I have brought you a gift." The whole company of folk halted behind the queen were still. "A gift? What manner of talk is this?" asked the queen irritably, but of her interest was caught. At this moment the child woke, cried aloud, and stood up. "Who is that child? Why do you bring him here?" The lass went to the child and held him firmly at her side. "He's a handsome child, isn't he?" "Is this the gift?" asked the queen coolly, but her eyes stared at the child. "In a manner of speaking," said the lass, just as coolly. "He was left in a hayfield last summer, a thin, sickly thing. Do you remember?" The queen said nothing. "I took him home with me, fed him, cared for him, brought him to health. I was pleased to do a favor for one of your women. Do you know his mother?" I am his mother, said the queen curtly. I thought he'd be of royal stock. He's that handsome and clever a child, said the lass, thinking a bit of flattery would do no harm. So you've brought him back to the fairy folk, said the queen in surprise. Didn't you want to keep him? He's of fairy stock. I don't think he'll thrive for long in the outside world, said the lass, and that seems a pity. Hand him up to me, said the queen. I want to see if this is really my child. No, said the lass. I've done you a favor, and now I ask one in return. I want my own son back. The queen frowned. I could seize the child. You could, admitted the lass, and her heart shook within her. But I did you a favor, nursed your child, shared the little food I had with him. It's said that fairy folk will repay favors honestly. All I ask is a fair exchange. I want my own child back. The queen laughed. You have cool courage, girl. Don't you know I could seize the both of you and keep you in our hill? I know that, said the lass steadily, but I was thinking you would want to repay the favor. He's a fine, handsome prince for your court. Abruptly, the queen called back to the folk behind her. Bring the dark-haired child, then to the lass. Now let me have this one. No, said the lass, not until I have my own in my arms. A stubborn lass, commented the queen. You have no fear at all. I admire that. Well, here he is. When the lass handed her own child on the grass beside her, she handed the fair-haired boy up to the queen. The queen held the child before her on the saddle. She said coolly, He is a healthy, handsome child. You took care of him well. Then looking down at the lass holding her own child tightly in her arms, she added, Go in peace. The favor and the goodwill of the fairy folk will stay with you and your child all his life. With a rush of wind and a jingle of bells, they were away. The eerie fairy glow was gone. The lass was alone on the dark, empty moor. Carrying her own child, she walked with a light heart to the old woman's cottage. As the queen had promised, good fortune and prosperity came to the lass, and her child stayed with them ever after.